Bon, alors, je pense qu'on doit commencer. Alors, j'ai le très grand plaisir de vous présenter quelqu'un qui n'a pas besoin d'une présentation, Robert Brandom, ici de l'Université de Pittsburgh, notre conférencier inaugural de l'année 2022. Alors, même s'il n'a pas besoin d'une introduction, je vais en donner une. Il est commencé professeur de philosophie à l'Université de Pittsburgh. Il a fait son doctorat à Princeton sous la direction de Richard Rorty et David Lewis. Il est auteur de nombreux livres. Alors, 10 selon mon compte, dont Making It Explicit, Tales of the Mighty Dead et plus récemment, A Spirit of Trust, qui est une lecture de la phénoménologie de Hegel. Brandom est l'une des principaux représentantes de pragmatisme, pardonnez l'expression, dans la philosophie actuelle. Et il est aussi, il faut dire, exceptionnellement pluraliste, qui est très pertinent pour nous parce que notre département commençait et divisé en 4 axes, philo-analytique, continental, historique et on peut dire normatif. Et on dirait que Brandom est l'une des rares philosophes à s'engager profondément en tous les 4 axes. Alors, il est un parfait conférencier inaugural pour l'année. Alors, on le remercie fortement pour son présence aujourd'hui. Il va présenter un article qui s'intitule Reasoning Relations in Semantic Conflict. Alors, le conférence sera en anglais, mais si vous préférez de poser une question après en français, ça va. Alors, Robert me dit qu'il comprend le français et sinon, je peux faire une traduction. Alors, pas de souci. Et comme j'ai dit, il y a un handout. Je vais le partager encore une fois maintenant. Et bon. So with that, Robert, I thank you again for being here. We're all extremely thrilled to have you and excited for your talk. So please go ahead and take her away when you're ready.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. It's a pleasure to be here. A familiar semantic order of explanation inspired by Frege begins with the distinction between 2 truth values, true and false. And it then seeks to explain what is truth evaluable, what can have those truth values, what's expressed by what we can, for that reason, understand syntactically as declarative sentences, in terms of truth or falsity conditions. These are thought of as states of the world that, in a distinctive semantic sense, make the truth evaluable sentences true or false. For that reason, they're intelligible as what sentences count as representing. In a suitable semantic metavocabulary, the truth conditions of or truth evaluable contents expressed by declarative sentences take the mathematical form of functions from the represented worldly states to the truth values of sentential representings of them. The core task of pragmatics is offering an account of what one is doing in saying or thinking something expressible by the use of declarative sentences. In this semantics-first order of explanation, pragmatics is thought of as explanatorily downstream from the representational semantic story. The individual abilities exercised or the social practices engaged in when speakers or thinkers use sentences with truth evaluable contents or meanings are to be understood in terms of truth evaluating practical attitudes. Taking true, in practice treating a sentence as expressing something true, is doxastically accepting it. Taking false, in practice treating a sentence as expressing something false, is doxastically rejecting it. Those doxastic stances or practical attitudes can be manifested publicly by using sentences to perform speech acts of asserting or denying. It follows that what can be asserted or denied, doxastically accepted or rejected, is just what can take truth values. A converse, pragmatics-first order of explanation begins with an account of the practical attitudes of doxastic acceptance and rejection, and seeks to understand in terms of them what is said or expressed by the declarative sentences used in the speech acts of assertion and denial that manifest those attitudes publicly. Instead of understanding semantic content representationally in terms of truth, one can look to further essential features of the discursive practices within which performances can have the pragmatic significance of assertions and denials, expressing doxastic practical attitudes of acceptance and rejection. For any autonomous discursive practice, any language game one can play, though one plays no other, must include not only the making of claims, manifesting doxastic acceptance or rejection of them, but also practices of challenging and defending those claims by giving reasons for and against them. So another strategy would be to try to understand what's said or claimed, the contents that can be accepted or rejected doxastically, in terms of those reason relations among claimables, that is, relations of being a reason for or against. The idea is to proceed in two stages, in understanding semantics in terms of pragmatics, meaning in terms of use. The first stage begins with practices of reasoning, practices of defending and challenging commitments to accept and reject, undertaken in the first instance by performing speech acts of asserting and denying. On the basis of an account of such critical reasoning practices involving claimings, it offers an account of the reason relations among claimables, what can be doxastically accepted or rejected, in virtue of which some claimings can serve as reasons for and against others. The second stage then elaborates a semantic understanding of the contents that can be doxastically accepted or rejected in terms of roles claimables expressed by declarative sentences play in those reason relations. The core of such a two-phase pragmatics-first semantic explanatory strategy is to use reason relations among claimable contents to mediate between a pragmatic account of what discursive practitioners do in making claims and giving and asking for reasons for them, on the one hand, and a semantic account of the claimable contents they assert and deny, defend and challenge by engaging in such practices, on the other hand. Here's a sketch of how the first stage of such an account of a path from pragmatics to semantics might go. We can unpack the distinction and relation between practices of reasoning about claimings, doxastic acceptances and rejections, and reason relations among claimable contents into these pieces. First, discursive practice as such involves reasoning. For in addition to accepting and rejecting what's expressed by declarative sentences, interlocutors must be able both to defend and to challenge the rational credentials of those stances or practical attitudes. Second, engaging in those critical practices, defending the credentials of a claiming, is producing further claimings that provide reasons for the acceptance or rejection being challenged. Challenging the credentials of a claiming is producing further claimings that provide reasons against the acceptance or rejection being challenged. Third, if accepting A functions practically as a reason to accept B, then A provides a reason for B. And if accepting A functions practically as a reason to reject B, then A provides a reason against B. Reason relations are relations that one set of claimables stand in to another, when the first consists of reasons for or against the other. Fourth, we can call those reason relations implication and incompatibility. To give a reason for is to commit oneself to accept premises that imply the claimable a reason is being given for. To give a reason against it is to commit oneself to accept premises that are incompatible with the claimable a reason is being given against. We're concerned here with rational implications, not specifically logical implications. This is the sense in which Pedro is a donkey implies Pedro is a mammal, because the goodness of that implication depends on the contents of the non-logical concepts donkey and mammal, rather than solely on the contents of logical concepts, such as those expressed by conditionals and negation. My hero Wilfrid Sellers calls these materially good implications. A promising direction in which such an account can be deepened and extended is suggested by Greg Restall and David Ripley's bilateralist normative pragmatic analysis of implication relations. They suggest that we understand the implication relation, gamma implies A, as saying that the position in which one is committed to accept all of gamma and to reject A is normatively out of bounds. This philosophically powerful pragmatic interpretation allows them to understand sequent calculi as consisting of rules that tell us that if some positions are out of bounds, then some others are also. This bilateralist, because it involves both sides of the turnstile, this bilateralist reading of implication understands the role of reason relations to be articulating norms that govern the adoption of practical doxastic attitudes of acceptance and rejection. They guide and constrain what interlocutors do by dividing constellations of attitudes into those that are appropriate or inappropriate, Restall and Ripley's inbounds and out of bounds, rather than by issuing imperatives that determine at any point what one must do. The normative pragmatic role of reason relations of implication and incompatibility can be further elaborated beyond this bilateralism by thinking about reasoning practices in terms of normative statuses of commitment and entitlement. Here, the basic claim is that to be intelligible as practices of reasoning, in the sense of accepting and rejecting claimables, and critically defending and challenging those stances with reasons for and against them, the participants in such practices must be understood as keeping track of two different kinds of normative status: the kind of commitment that one undertakes or acknowledges in accepting or rejecting a claimable by asserting or denying a sentence expressing it, and the sort of entitlement to that status or practical attitude that's at issue when reasons are offered for or against it. Accepting or rejecting a claimable, paradigmatically by asserting or denying it, is taking a stand on it, adopting a stance towards it. It's committing oneself with respect to it, in the way one would by saying yay or nay to it in response to a suitable yes or no, yes/no question. But what difference does it then make whether an interlocutor can offer reasons to accept what he's accepted or to reject what he's rejected? The commitments involved, the stances taken up, the attitudes adopted are the same either way. But it's also an integral feature of specifically doxastic commitments that one's entitlement to those commitments is always potentially at issue. For in taking up a doxastic stance, one renders oneself liable to critical demands for justification, for exhibition of reasons to accept or reject the claim one has accepted or rejected. One may be challenged to show that the position one has adopted is normatively appropriate, that it's in bounds, that it's a commitment one was entitled to adopt. Reasons matter because other practitioners must distinguish between the acceptances and rejections the speaker is entitled to in virtue of having reasons to adopt those attitudes, and those the speaker is not entitled to because unable to defend those commitments by offering reasons when suitably challenged to do so. It follows that for each interlocutor, there must be not only a difference between the attitudes, the commitments he has adopted, and those he has not, but also within those he has adopted, between those he's entitled to or justified in, has rational credentials for, and those that are mere commitments, bare of such accompanying entitlements. In making it explicit, I argue that part of what turns practically on one's entitlement or justification, the second person correlate of the first person responsibility to defend one's commitments when one's entitlement is suitably challenged is the testimonial authority of one's act, its capacity to license others to adopt a corresponding attitude. The essential point is that in addition to the committive dimension of assertional practice, there's a critical dimension, the aspect of the practice in which the rational propriety of those commitments, their justificatory status, is assessed. I implicitly invoked this dimension of entitlement earlier when I talked about defending and challenging the credentials of commitments. Restall-Ripley bilateralism explains implication in terms of a single pragmatic normative status, a constellation, the notion of a constellation of acceptances and rejections being in bounds, or contrastingly, out of bounds, appropriate or inappropriate, okay or not okay. Distinguishing the two normative statuses of commitment and entitlement and their contrasting statuses permits us to discern further fine structure, going beyond the Restall-Ripley picture. In these terms, to say that a constellation of acceptances and rejections is out of bounds is to say that it's a collection of commitments to which one cannot be jointly entitled. In terms of commitments and entitlements, we can lay alongside their analysis of implication the analysis of incompatibility that I offer in making it explicit. There, the idea is the two commitments are incompatible when commitment to one precludes entitlement to the other. Ryan Simonelli has nicely synthesized this understanding of incompatibility with the Restall-Ripley understanding of implication. Gamma implies A, just in case commitment to accept everything in the premise set gamma precludes entitlement to reject A. And gamma is incompatible with, rules out A, just in case commitment to accept everything in premise set gamma precludes entitlement to accept A. Like the original normative pragmatic bilateral account of implication, these principles make explicit what it is that practitioners need to do in order thereby practically to be taking or treating some claimables to imply or be incompatible with others. They need to take or treat some commitments as precluding entitlement to others in keeping deontic score on their own and others' normative statuses. The more articulated bilateral account of normative pragmatic functional roles that relations among the acceptables and rejectables expressed by declarative sentences must play in order for them to count as reason relations of implication and incompatibility can be connected to the prior discussion of how such relations are intelligible as providing reasons for and against commitments in critical practices of defending and challenging them by the next two principles, 7 and 8. First, any set of commitments that precludes entitlement to reject A, thereby implicitly commits one to accept A. And any set of commitments that precludes entitlement to accept A, thereby implicitly commits one to reject A. We can think of those principles as codifying definitions of a concept of some commitments being implicit in others. In the case of implication, they're implicit in the literal sense of being implied by a premise set. Here, that fundamental, etymologically natural notion of implicitness is being extended to include reason relations of incompatibility on the basis of the pragmatic definitions 5 and 6 of implication and incompatibility, which show them to be two species of one genus. On this account, a reason against a rejection is an implication of acceptance of that conclusion, since gamma implies A says that commitment to all of gamma precludes entitlement to reject A. That's the same as a reason for acceptance. And dually, an incompatibility, gamma is incompatible with A, exhibits its premises gamma as providing both a reason against acceptance and so a reason for rejection. These principles 1 through 8 outline an order of explanation that begins with a characterization of practices of making claims and defending and challenging them, and ends with a specification of the functional role relations among the contents that are accepted or rejected, defended or challenged, must play in order properly to be understood as reason relations, relations of implication and incompatibility among those claimables. This is the first step in the two-stage pragmatics-first strategy for understanding semantic content. The second step is then to go on to show how to understand the semantic contents of the declarative sentences used to assert and deny in terms of the reason relations of implication and incompatibility among those claimables. So I turn next to that task. The idea is that once we have an understanding from the side of pragmatics of the fundamental pair of opposite but complementary reason relations, namely implication and incompatibility, it'll be possible to use them to formulate a semantic theory, explicating the acceptables, rejectables expressed by declarative sentences. Understanding what can be doxastically accepted or rejected in terms of the roles declarative sentences can play in reason relations of implication and incompatibility would provide a purely pragmatic explication of a fundamental semantic concept, the concept of the contents expressed by those declarative sentences. What I want to do next is to explain two contributions to this enterprise that are made by recent work by two other members of the Research on Logical Expressivism, the ROLL working group in Pittsburgh, your colleague across town at Concordia, Ulf Hlobil, who's in the audience here, and Dan Kaplan, who has just joined him as a postdoc at Concordia. Hlobil offers an illuminating perspective on the relation between a pragmatic story along the lines I've been telling here and the best contemporary work in formal semantics. Kaplan shows in detail how a radically different kind of semantic account of the contents expressed by declarative sentences can be elaborated directly from the role those sentences play in reason relations of implication and incompatibility. So I want to briefly rehearse those two different ways of thinking about semantics. One of the most sophisticated, flexible, and expressively powerful formal semantic understandings of conceptual contents available today is Kit Fine's Truthmaker semantics. It's built on a space of what he calls states. We're invited to think of the states as facts or situations, but the notion is an adaptable one, sufficiently general to include whatever it is that we might think of as making declarative sentences true or false. A subset of the space of states is distinguished as the possible states. The only structure imposed on the state space is a partial ordering of parthood, a mereological order. Some states are parts of others. It's assumed that every subset of the space has a least upper bound, which can be thought of as the fusion of the elements of the subset, the unique whole of which they're all parts. The content or proposition expressed by a sentence, A, is then specified, again, bilaterally as a pair of set of states, those verifying states that would make it true and the falsifying states that would make it false. Like its predecessor, intentional semantics appealing to possible worlds, Truthmaker semantics advances from the fundamental opposition of truth and falsity to a notion of content as truth conditions and falsehood conditions. It is more general in including the notion of falsity conditions, which are not assumed in general to be uniformly computable from the truth conditions. And its basic notion of a state is more capacious than that of a possible world. Sort of situations or parts of possible worlds are a model. Further flexibility in the form of what Fine calls hyperintentionality is secured by not restricting the state space to possible states, but embedding those in a larger structure that includes multiple distinct impossible states. In addition, the mereological part-whole structure of the state space provides expressive resources in the Truthmaker semantic metavocabulary that have no analog in classical possible world semantics. The bilateral conception of content, including falsifiers as well as verifiers, and not assuming that either sort of semantic interpretant can straightforwardly be computed from the other, turns out to pay large expressive dividends. The Truthmaker semantic framework permits various definitions of the reason relations of implication and, though he doesn't focus on this, incompatibility. A state T counts as incompatible with a set of states just in case the fusion of it with all the states in S is an impossible state. We can then say that gamma is incompatible with A just in case any fusion of verifiers of all the members of gamma with any verifier of A is an impossible state. On the side of implication, there are a number of different notions of semantic consequence definable in the Truthmaker setting. And Fine considers it a signal virtue of his approach that it can express and compare such a variety of senses of follows from. For instance, gamma verifier entails A in case every state that verifies all the sentences of gamma verifies A. Ulf Hlobil shows how the Truthmaker framework allows the definition of a further notion of implication, which Fine does not consider. We can say in 9, gamma implies delta if and only if any fusion of a state that verifies all the members of gamma with a state that falsifies all the members of delta is an impossible state. And Hlobil invites us to compare this semantic notion of multi-succedent implication. We have a set of conclusions as well as a set of premises. Hlobil invites us to compare this semantic Truthmaker notion of multi-succedent implication with Restall and Ripley's bilateral normative pragmatic notion. Recall that they understand, in 10, gamma implies delta if and only if any position that includes accepting all of gamma and rejecting all of delta is normatively incoherent or out of bounds. As we've read it, one cannot be entitled to such a constellation of commitments. Both conceptions can be thought of as stemming from the same intuition that led C.I. Lewis to define his notion of strict implication by saying that in this sense of implies, A implies B in case it's impossible for A to be true and B to be false. Now, it's clear that, as Hlobil argues, these are isomorphic understandings of implication. The role played in the Truthmaker semantic definition by verifiers and falsifiers of sentences is played in the bilateral normative pragmatic definition by practical attitudes of acceptance and rejection of sentences. And the role played in the Truthmaker semantic definition by the impossibility of the state that results from fusing those verifiers and falsifiers is played in the bilateral pragmatic definition by the normative incoherence or out of boundness of the position that results from concomitant commitment to those acceptances and rejections. I believe that this isomorphism between the definition of reason relations of implication and incompatibility in the bilateral semantic framework of verifiers and falsifiers and in the bilateral pragmatic framework of acceptance and rejection is deep and revealing. To begin with, it shows how the connection between two paired truth values and two paired doxastic attitudes expressed in the principle that accepting is taking true and rejecting is taking false is reflected and can be further elaborated at the level of the reason relations of implication and incompatibility that articulate the contents that can be true or taken true and false or taken false. In particular, I think, substantial new light is shed on what one must do to count thereby as adopting a practical attitude of taking some claimable to be true or false, when those attitudes are situated in the wider context of critical practices of giving reasons for and against claimables that are constrained by reason relations of implication and incompatibility. The isomorphic relation between what's expressed by semantic metavocabularies of truth makers and false makers and what's expressed by pragmatic metavocabularies of bilateral commitments and preclusions of entitlement clarifies the relations between what one is saying and what one must be doing in order to say that, in using the object language those semantic and pragmatic metavocabularies address. In practically acknowledging that commitment to accept some claimables precludes entitlement to reject some others and to accept still others, practitioners are, we can now see, thereby taking it that the fusion of verifiers of the premises and falsifiers or verifiers of the conclusions are impossible states. Alethic modal relations of possibility, impossibility, and necessity are part of the essential structure of the worldly states and situations that, according to the Truthmaker semantic model, make claimables true or false, and so are what is represented and talked of or thought about by the use of declarative sentences. Deontic normative relations of commitment, entitlement, and the preclusion of entitlement are part of the essential structure of discursive practical attitudes, adoption of which, according to the Pragmatics-first model, is what practitioners must do in order thereby to count as practically taking or treating what is expressed by declarative sentences as true or false, thereby representing the world as being some ways and not others by saying or thinking that things are thus and so. The very same reason relations of implication and incompatibility, which articulate the claimable contents expressed by declarative sentences, but can both be true and false and be practically taken to be true or false by affirming or denying them, can be construed equally and isomorphically, both semantically in alethic modal terms of making true or false, and pragmatically in deontic normative terms of the practical doxastic attitudes of taking true or false, accepting or rejecting. In A Spirit of Trust, I attribute a view recognizably of this shape to Hegel, under the rubric of bimodal hylomorphic conceptual realism. Hegel emphasizes reason relations of material incompatibility, Aristotelian contrariety, over those of implication or material consequence. That is, Hegel's notion of determinate negation is more basic for him than his notion of mediation, though both of them are always in play. As I read him, Hegel begins with the thought that ways the world can objectively be, states of affairs or possible facts, are determinate just insofar as they exclude and entail one another in a way properly expressed in alethic modal terms. That the coin is copper makes it impossible that it remains solid at 1100 degrees Celsius and necessitates its being an electrical conductor. Incompatible with the one implies the other. By contrast, our subjective takings of the world to be some way, our thoughts, are determinate just insofar as they exclude and entail one another in a way properly expressed in deontic normative terms. As I've been suggesting here that we put the point, my commitment to the coins being copper precludes entitlement to accepting that it would remain solid at 1100 degrees Celsius and precludes entitlement to rejecting that it's an electrical conductor. One and the same determinate content, that the coin is copper, can take two forms. An objective one, in which it's understood as articulated by relations of exclusion and consequence construed in the alethic modal vocabulary proper to the expression of laws of nature, and a subjective one in which it's understood as articulated by relations of exclusion and consequence, construed in the deontic normative vocabulary, proper to the expression of discursive practices. That's why I use the term bimodal hylomorphism. One content can take two forms, the subjective and the objective, depending on whether we read the relations of consequence and exclusion in alethic modal terms or in deontic normative terms. And the view is properly denominated conceptual realism because it's the very same conceptual content in which we adopt attitudes to in thought that's understood, albeit as present, in a different form in the objective world thought about. So the world is accordingly construed as essentially always already in thinkable shape. The isomorphism that Hlobil has worked out between Restall and Ripley's normative bilateral construal of implication and incompatibility and a version of Fine's Truthmaker semantics is a colorable contemporary development of a thought cognate to the bimodal hylomorphic conceptual realism that I attribute to Hegel. It suggests how something like this thought can be worked out in detail, for it maps onto one another a semantic idiom of great expressive power and flexibility and a pragmatic idiom that has shown its substantial utility in understanding sequent calculi. Each has been used to characterize the fine structure of reason relations in actual applications to multifarious different object vocabularies. Now, when I introduced the idea of a pragmatics-first order of explanation, which would start with practices of accepting and rejecting and giving and asking for reasons entitling one to adopt those attitudes, so challenging and defending doxastic commitments, I held out the prospect of a recognizably semantic understanding of the claimables that can be accepted or rejected, taken to be true or false, made available in terms of the reason relations of implication and incompatibility those claimables stand into one another. We've seen how such reason relations can be understood, on the one hand, in normative pragmatic terms of commitment and preclusion of entitlement, and how those very same reason relations can be reconstructed in paradigmatically semantic terms of worldly states or situations taken to make claimables true or false. But although the Truthmaker semantics underwrites both the notion of the content expressed by declarative sentences and reason relations of implication and incompatibility that can also be understood in normative pragmatic metavocabulary, the Truthmaker setting does not explain truth evaluable content by appeal to those reason relations. Rather, it explains both content and reason relations in terms of modalized spaces of possible and impossible worldly states, verifying and falsifying claimables. Striking as the isomorphism is that Hlobil points out and works out between Truthmaker's semantic construals of implication and incompatibility and normative pragmatic construals of them, it doesn't amount to an explanation of claimable contents by means of reason relations. It connects them, but it doesn't explain the one in terms of the other. It does not by itself, accordingly, count as redeeming the promissory note I issued on behalf of a pragmatics-first order of semantic explanation. But we can do that. And to do it, we can look at the implicational phase space semantics developed by Dan Kaplan, a Pittsburgh member of our role logic working group. As I say, he's at the moment Ulf's postdoc at Concordia. That semantics implements precisely what I've been promising, an understanding of what's expressed by declarative sentences in terms of the role those sentences play in reason relations of implication and incompatibility. In so doing, it fulfills the defining aspiration of the philosophical tradition I call semantic inferentialism. It begins with what I regard as a remarkable conceptual innovation. Not only are the semantic interpretants it appeals to implications and incompatibilities, but so is what's interpreted. That is, in this implicational phase space semantics, the principal and original bearers of semantic significance are construed not as sentences, but themselves as implications. And it's only at a second stage that we assign semantic content to sentences. The points of an implicational phase space are candidate implications, defined on a language thought of as a set of logically atomic sentences. The candidate implications are then all pairs of the form gamma delta of sets of sentences of the language. They're what I've been representing by statements formed using the snake turnstile, gamma turnstile, delta. This is the sort of thing manipulated in proof-theoretic multi-succedent sequent calculi and given normative pragmatic interpretations by Restall Ripley bilateralism. Now, I call the points of the implicational phase space candidate implications because they don't all represent good implications, just candidates for that status. The good implications, the ones that actually hold, the ones where delta really follows from gamma, intuitively where the set on the right-hand side, taken disjunctively, is a genuine consequence of the set of premises on the left-hand side, taken conjunctively, are marked as members of a distinguished subspace I of good implications. The third element of an implicational phase space semantic model for a language L, in addition to the space of candidate implication points L cross L, and the subspace of good implications I, is an operation of adjunction of candidate implications. To adjoin two candidate implications, one produces a third candidate implications by combining, just by set theoretic union, their premises, and then combining, in the set theoretic sense of unioning, their conclusions. With the minimal candidate implication, the pair of the empty set and the empty set, playing the role of an identity element, adjunction is then a commutative monoid on the space L cross L. Each candidate implication can now be assigned as its semantic interpretant the set of candidate implications whose adjunctions with it yield good implications, implications that are in the distinguished set I. The V set of a candidate implication gamma delta is what you need to add to, adjoin to it, to get a good implication. Intuitively, if gamma delta is already a good implication, if it's in the distinguished set I, that fact will be marked by the fact that the minimal candidate implication, empty set, will be in its gamma set. If gamma delta is a good implication, its V set is something like the range of subjunctive robustness, what you can add to its premises without turning it from a good implication into a bad implication. Focusing for simplicity on the premise set gamma, the V set is telling us what further collateral premises you can add to it without infirming that implication. If the hungry lioness sees a limping gazelle nearby, then she will pursue it. And that implication would still be good even if a beetle on a distant tree climbs a bit further out on the branch it's sitting on. But it would not be good if the lioness were suddenly struck by lightning. So the V set is telling us the implication conditions of the goodness conditions of this implication. If the candidate implication is not a good one, its V set tells us what we would need to add to it, adjoin to it, to make it a good one. Intuitively, the V sets play a role with respect to implications that's analogous to the role played in more traditional semantics by truth conditions with respect to sentences. They both specify what it would take for one of them to be, for one, the implication or the sentence, respectively, to be semantically good in the different ways in which implications and sentences can be semantically good. At the second separate subsequent stage, this semantic interpretation of implications by sets of implications can then be extended to specify the semantic roles played by sentences in implications and in incompatibilities, rather than just the implications themselves. In this implications-first inferentialist setting, a sentence A can be represented for semantic purposes by a pair of implications, A empty set and empty set A. The semantic content expressed by the sentence in the set of its role in reason relations of implication and incompatibility is represented by the V sets of those paired implications. The V set of A empty set determines the set of all the good implications in which A figures as a premise. And the V set of empty set A determines the set of all the good implications in which A figures as a conclusion. For each tells us what additions to the bare skeletons of A empty set and empty set A yield good implications. The nature of the adjunction operation, in terms of which, together with the set I of good implications, the V sets are defined, ensures that A appears as a premise in every element of the set of good implications that results, and as a conclusion in every element of the set of good implications that forms the second element. And the claim is that broadly inferential roles, in the sense specified by pairs of premissory and conclusory V sets, are good representations of what one must grasp in order to understand what one is accepting or rejecting in undertaking doxastic commitments. For its inferential roles in this sense that determine what's a reason for and against the claims to which one is committing oneself, and so what it would take to entitle oneself to those attitudes, and the acts of affirmation and denial that overtly manifest them. For that reason, they're good semantic representations of the claimable contents expressed by declarative sentences. A minimal criterion of adequacy for Kaplan's implicational phase-space semantics is that it can be shown to offer attractable semantics for the logically complex sentences that result when we extend the logically atomic language by introducing sentential logical vocabulary according to a wide variety of sequent rules. And indeed, Kaplan proves soundness and completeness results using the implicational phase-space semantics for a number of logics, including not only classical and intuitionistic logic, but a wide variety of substructural, non-monotonic, non-transitive logics. This broadly inferentialist semantic account of the claimable contents expressed by declarative sentences is what I had in mind when I initially raised the possibility that a pragmatics-first approach that understands reason relations of implication and incompatibility in normative terms of what one is doing in adopting doxastic practical attitudes of accepting and rejecting claims and challenging and defending entitlement to the resulting commitment by offering reasons for and against them, could be built on, extended, and developed to provide an adequate semantics. So at this point, I've waved my hands at least at two different routes to semantics. I've described how Hlobil offers a way of understanding his version of reason relations, paradigmatically implication, in Fine's Truthmaker semantics, in terms of an isomorphism with Restall and Ripley's bilateralist normative pragmatics. And I've explained in general terms how Kaplan defines his implicational phase-space semantics directly in terms of implication and incompatibility relations, which we've seen can be understood in normative pragmatic terms of acceptance and rejection, commitments and preclusions of entitlement. I want to close by comparing and contrasting the reconstructions of reason relations of implication and incompatibility offered by these two semantic approaches, that is, in terms of truthmakers and in terms of implications. The first thing I think is to appreciate the strong formal analogies between the two frameworks. The modalized state spaces of truthmaker semantics are built on sets of states which are not further specified. The states making up these spaces could be pretty much anything. which of course contributes greatly to the expressive flexibility of Fein's apparatus. Within the set S of states, a privileged subset of good ones, his S diamond, is distinguished intuitively by its alethic modal status as the possible states. Kaplan's implicational phase spaces are sets of points that have more structure than Fein's states. They're candidate implications, pairs of sets of sentences drawn from an antecedent prelogical language. Within this space L cross L of implications, a privileged subset of good ones, I, is distinguished intuitively by its normative status as codifying the proper implications, what really follows from what. The operations on states or candidate implications, Kit Fein's fusion and Dan Kaplan's adjunction, the one stipulated, the other defined in terms of that additional structure on the space of candidate implications, are algebraically both commutative monoids. The semantic interpretants of sentences are in both cases bilateral, pairs of verifiers and falsifiers, and premissory and conclusory V-sets, respectively. Now, there's also a substantial formal difference between the two settings. In the Truthmaker framework, the modalized state space with its fusion operation, or the part-whole relation among states, is wholly distinct from the language it's used to interpret semantically. To get a semantic model, a third element is required, an interpretation function that maps sentences of the language onto pairs of sets of verifying and falsifying states. In the implicational phase space framework, there's nothing corresponding to this extra element, connecting and mediating between the language and the space on which it's interpreted. The extra structure that the points of the implicational phase space come with, there being candidate implications in the form of pairs of sets of sentences of the language, not only means that the monoidal operation of adjunction of candidate implications can be explicitly defined set theoretically, as opposed to being simply stipulated as it has to be with fusions of states, but because the sentences themselves are already present in the space from which the semantic interpretants are drawn, the V function that semantically interprets first implications and then sentences can also be explicitly defined set theoretically from the raw materials already present in the implicational phase space itself. In this sense, the interpretation function connecting sentences to their semantic interpretants is intrinsic to the sentences as they figure in the space of implications. The sentences come already interpreted by the reason relations they stand into one another, that is, the roles they play in reason relations of implications and incompatibilities. All the semantic framework does is draw that implicit intrinsic interpretation out explicitly. But in spite of the substantial difference in the conceptions of semantic interpretation that animate the two different approaches, the fact that both take the mathematical form of commutative monoids plus distinguished subspaces, relations of fusion and adjunction together with these distinguished subspaces, means that their treatment of the crucial reason relations of implication and incompatibility share enough structure to be intertranslatable across those two very different settings. That is, we can specify exactly the same reason relations of implication and incompatibility while moving systematically between the modalized state spaces of Truthmaker semantics and implicational phase space semantics. Now, I've made the paper available. In the paper, I sort of show how to do this. I'm not going to go through with it. I'm not going to walk through it. You're going to have to take my word for it. But you can look at the paper and see some of the cash for that promise. The result from a little dancing back and forth between these frameworks is a straightforward uniform translation between Kaplan's implicational phase space semantics and Fein's Truthmaker semantics. Each Truthmaker model on a language corresponds to an implicational phase space defined on that same language in the sense that they underwrite exactly the same reason relations of implication and incompatibility. That's my result connecting these two semantic forms, building on both Hlobil's and Kaplan's results. And this translation shows how truthmaker semantics can be deflated, at least from the point of view of semantic inferentialism. For it shows how to extract what the inferentialist insists is its semantic core, namely the way it functions to codify the reason relations of implication and incompatibility that articulate claimable, assertable and deniable, so propositional contents. The representational metaphysical reading of truth-making states in Fine's setting is from this perspective optional and inessential, at best a harmless indulgence, and at worst a misleading characterization of the semantic enterprise. So, in conclusion, I've sketched an order of explanation that moves from pragmatics to semantics. The most basic use of linguistic expressions is to perform speech acts of assertion and denial, manifesting doxastic attitudes of accepting and rejecting. I claimed what makes the practical attitudes doxastic attitudes, and so makes the locutions that express them declarative sentences, is their standing liability to critical challenges by assertions that provide reasons against them, and the consequent critical obligation to defend them by assertions that provide reasons for them. Those critical dialogic practices make intelligible reason relations of incompatibility and implication, which can be understood in terms of normative statuses of commitment to accept and reject, and preclusion of entitlement to such commitments. The second stage of the envisaged pragmatics-first order of explanation then semantically characterizes the claimable contents expressed by the declarative sentences that are asserted or denied, what can be doxastically accepted or rejected, in terms of the functional role those sentences play in reason relations of implication and incompatibility. Dan Kaplan's substructural implicational phase space semantics shows in detail how an expressively powerful formal semantics can be elaborated from the material relations of implication and incompatibility that precipitate out of the functionalist story told in such a normative pragmatic metavocabulary. That's the principal story I want to put on the table. And we saw an exciting recent result of Ulf Hlobil's shows that Kit Fine's truthmaker semantics stands in surprising relations to the normative pragmatics that I've gestured at here. And I build on that result to show that it also stands in surprising relations to Kaplan's inferentialist semantics. And as a secondary project, I've sketched how those results can be used to facilitate the comparison of the pragmatics first order of explanation with the most sophisticated contemporary development of the semantics first order of explanation. For we see first that the pragmatic significance of relations of implication and incompatibility, defined in truthmaker terms, can be articulated in bilateralist terms of the Restall Ripley sort, and by extension in terms of the normative statuses of commitment and entitlement that I've suggested here to sharpen and develop that account. This new way of building a pragmatics on top of a truthmaker semantics marks a fault line, or at least a division of labor within the truthmaker setting. On the one hand, there's the metaphysical story about states, about their mereological fusion, and about the division of them into possible and impossible states. On the other side, there are the reason relations of implication and incompatibility that Hlobil shows how to define on that basis. The pragmatic connection to discursive practices of defending and challenging doxastic attitudes of acceptance and rejection depends only on that latter half. That's the only part of the semantic story that shows up as pragmatically significant. To show that the metaphysics matters to, or further is even somehow implicit in, the use of the expression to whose meaning it purports to contribute, some further pragmatic story would have to be told that goes beyond the one envisaged here. And truthmaker semantics as it stands now does not come with a corresponding native, equally developed pragmatics. Further, we saw that the meaning relations of implication and incompatibility generated by the heavily metaphysically committive truthmaker semantics can be reproduced exactly within the much less metaphysically committive implicational phase space semantics, all of whose primitives can be understood as implicit in the pragmatics that specifies the use of expressions in discursive practice. So room is opened up for a deflated version of the Truthmaker semantics. The claim here would be that the commutative monoid that does the heavy lifting in Truthmaker semantics has been mischaracterized, needlessly and misleadingly encrusted with functionally irrelevant Baroque metaphysical ornamentation. Underneath that misleading guise, what's doing the real semantic work is Kaplan's operator adjoining premises and conclusions of implications to mark their ranges of subjunctive robustness. And we can understand those basic semantic notions, the reason relations of implication and incompatibility, in terms of a normative bilateral pragmatics of the sort pioneered by Restall and Ripley. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Robert. That was great. I think we'll take maybe a 5-minute bio break, just in case anybody needs one. And then we'll reconvene around 5:38. On va prendre une pause de 5 minutes. Évidemment, si vous avez compris la conférence, vous avez compris ce que j'ai dit en anglais. Mais je l'ai dit en français quand même. Okay, so at like 4:38, 4:39, we'll come back with questions. And I'll give you, we'll try to prioritize the students. So maybe students who want to ask questions go first. Okay, well, we'll come back and we'll start the queue when we get back. See you soon.